if you're talking about Western myths of the Second World War, the most prevalent myth, generalized myth, would be something along these lines, that the primary victor of the Second World War was the United States, right? And the primary outcome of that war was the so-called rules-based international order. And the history of the post-war world is a history of the United States protecting and developing that rules-based order, which then triumphs in the post-Cold War years in the 1990s, right? And it's that rules-based order is now under threat, right? Is being destroyed by states, Russia, China, other countries, which want to undermine that rules-based order and replace it with their own order. Okay, so that's the Western myth. So the Soviet Union, China, and the United States, other countries, it was a broad coalition that won the war. As I was saying earlier, it wasn't a war for a US-led rules-based order. It was a war for the re-establishment of the state sovereignty system, right? And that goal was achieved, right? And that goal was actually embodied in the United Nations and its charter, which is basically, and the United Nations was the successor to the League of Nations, and both the League of Nations and the United Nations are organizations of sovereign states, in which sovereignty is the central element of their makeup, right? So that was one, and the other outcome was that it wasn't going to be a rules-based order led by the United States. What there was going to be would be a concert of great powers, yeah, a collective hegemony of the great powers, primarily United States and the Soviet Union, but also Britain, China, France, and other countries. So there was going to be it would be a great power unity, which would preside over the post-war development of this state-based system. Of course, that didn't happen. It didn't happen because after the Second World War, you got the Cold War, right? And that's what comes after the Second World War. It's not this rules-based order. That's an invention of the 1990s. You get the Cold War. You get the development of these Cold War blocs, including a United States-led Western bloc, which eventually comes to define itself as being the whole of the international order. It's only after the end of the Cold War, early 1990s, that this Western bloc comes to see itself as this so-called rules-based order. And what that means that they want to universalize their rules and their values, their hegemony, and their power system. And that is what they attempt to do in the 1990s. The fundamental outcome of the Second World War is the restoration of the sovereign-based state system, right? The defeat of the Axis attempt to overthrow that system, right? And in connection with that, there are all kinds of treaties signing, including the establishment of the United Nations, right? So that's the fundamental structure that emerges from the war, right? And actually, it's a structure that persists, right? Okay, it comes under threat because of the Cold War division and polarizations, and later on, it comes under threat and challenge by, Western and American global liberal hegemony in the 1990s, right? But nevertheless, throughout the Cold War, the fundamental nature of international politics based on this sovereign state system persists, remains the same. And it does that for a number of reasons, including reasons connected with the Cold War itself. So one of the reasons that the state system persists as present day is because of the process of decolonization, the post-Second World War process of decolonization, where you get the emergence of a number of new independent states. I mean, many of them form part of what we now refer to as the global south. In those days, they were referred to as the third world or developing countries. But anyway, those new states were committed to a sovereignty-based state system. That is what they wanted, because that empowered them as being members of that system, rather than being, continuing their colonial domination. So that was very important. The other important factor in maintaining this state system, despite the Cold War, despite the Western project of basically trying to dominate it and change its very character, is the post-Second World War rise or reemergence of China. China is was and is one of the foremost defenders of the sovereign state system.